Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. South Korea seems to have taken a really hard turn back towards its more authoritarian past.
Yeah.
So on December 4th, 2024, President Yoon Suk-yeol declared martial law.
Wow.
And this move really throws the country's democratic future into serious doubt. I mean, it's the first time this kind of drastic measure has been invoked since 1980.
Right.
And the ripple effects are being felt, I think, way beyond South Korea's borders. So today we're doing a deep dive into this situation.
Okay.
We've got reports from the ground, we have some political analysis and some historical context to try to make sense of this whole thing.
It's a really pivotal moment to understand what's at stake here. We need to unpack exactly what martial law means, especially in the South Korean context.
Okay, let's start there. What powers does martial law actually give the government? What impact does it have on people's everyday lives?
Well, martial law essentially hands the reins of power over to the military. It suspends civil liberties like freedom of speech, the right to assemble, even due process. It allows for military tribunals to replace civilian courts, and it gives the government sweeping authority to detain individuals without charges. In South Korea specifically, President Yoon's declaration could mean soldiers patrolling the streets, restrictions on travel and communication, and even the temporary dissolution of the National Assembly.
So it's not just about increased security, it's a fundamental shift in how the country is governed.
Exactly.
But what's the justification for such a drastic move?
Well, President Yoon claims that the opposition Democratic Party is engaged in pro-North Korean activities that are a threat to national security. He's pointed to alleged connections between some Democratic Party members and North Korean operatives. He's citing intelligence reports of clandestine meetings and information sharing.
Wow, those are some serious accusations.
Yeah.
But how are they being received? Is there evidence to back them up?
That's where things get really murky. Critics of President Yoon see this as a politically motivated power grab. They argue that these accusations of pro-North Korean activity are vague and unsubstantiated. They're designed to discredit the opposition and silence dissent.
Okay.
They point to Yoon's plummeting approval ratings, a struggling economy, and a series of recent political scandals as evidence that he's kind of grasping at straws to maintain control.
So we have two competing narratives. A president claiming to protect the nation from a hidden enemy and an opposition crying foul. What's been the immediate fallout from this declaration of martial law?
Chaos, for one thing. Protests have erupted across the country, especially in Seoul, where thousands have gathered in front of the National Assembly defying the martial law restrictions.
Wow.
There have been clashes with police and reports of arrests and detentions.
It sounds like the South Korean people aren't going down without a fight.
Absolutely. And the political pushback has been just as swift. The National Assembly, which is currently controlled by the Democratic Party, held an emergency session and voted overwhelmingly to revoke the martial law declaration. This sets up a potential constitutional crisis.
A constitutional crisis? That sounds serious. Can you break that down a bit?
Yeah, so it means you have two branches of government directly challenging each other's authority. President Yoon argues that he has the power to declare martial law under the Constitution, especially in times of national emergency.
Right.
The National Assembly, on the other hand, contends that the president's actions are unconstitutional and that their vote to revoke martial law should be binding. This could end up being decided by South Korea's constitutional court.
Okay.
And the outcome will have a huge impact on the balance of power going forward.
So we have protests in the streets, a political showdown brewing, and the very foundations of South Korea's democracy are being tested. It's hard not to see the echoes of a dark chapter in the country's past.
You're right to bring up the historical parallels. The ghost of Gwangju hangs heavy over this situation.
For those who aren't familiar, can you remind us what happened in Gwangju?
Okay, so in May 1980, South Korea was under the rule of a military dictatorship. Pro-democracy protests broke out in the city of Gwangju, and the government responded with brutal force. They declared martial law, and they sent in paratroopers to crush the uprising. Hundreds of civilians were killed, and the massacre became a symbol of the regime's brutality.
Wow.
Yeah.
Gwangju became a rallying cry for the pro-democracy movement, didn't it?
Exactly. While it was a horrific tragedy, it also planted the seeds for change. The memory of Gwangju galvanized the movement, and it ultimately helped pave the way for South Korea's transition to democracy in 1987.
So while the contexts are different, President Yoon's declaration of martial law is dredging up a lot of painful memories and raising fears that the country might be backsliding towards authoritarianism.
That's the big question looming over this entire situation. How will this impact South Korea's democratic institutions? Will this be a temporary measure, Or are we witnessing a more fundamental shift in the balance of power? To explore those questions, we need to look beyond South Korea's borders and examine how the international community is reacting to this crisis. South Korea doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's a linchpin in East Asian geopolitics, a major economic power, and a key U.S. ally. So President Yoon's actions are sending shockwaves through the region and beyond.
Let's start with the regional players.
Hmm.
How are South Korea's neighbors reacting to this crisis?
Well, there's a lot of anxiety, particularly in Japan. They see a stable and democratic South Korea as essential to their own security. The prospect of instability, or even worse, a military escalation that involves North Korea, is a major concern for them. They're watching the situation really closely and urging all sides to kind of exercise restraint.
What about China? They've got a complicated relationship with both Koreas.
China's response has been more cautious, I'd say. They've called for stability and dialogue, but they're also wary of any moves that could strengthen the U.S. influence in the region. And remember, they're still technically at war with South Korea, even though there's been an armistice in place since 1953.
And, of course, we can't forget about North Korea. I imagine they're having a field day with this.
Oh, absolutely. This is a propaganda goldmine for the Kim regime. They're using it to paint South Korean democracy as, weak and chaotic, further justifying their own authoritarian system. They've even hinted at offering support to the South Korean people, which is a thinly veiled attempt to stir up more trouble.
It sounds like this crisis is playing right into their hands.
Yeah.
What about the reactions from further afield? What are international organizations and other major powers saying?
Well, the UN has expressed deep concern about the situation. They've called for the restoration of civil liberties and urged all parties to respect human rights even under martial law. And there's been a chorus of similar statements from human rights organizations all around the world.
And what about the U.S.? South Korea is one of their most important allies. This must be a tricky situation for them.
Yeah, it's a real diplomatic tightrope walk.
Yeah.
On the one hand, they have a treaty obligation to defend South Korea and a strong interest in maintaining stability in the region.
Right.
On the other hand, they're clearly uncomfortable with the erosion of democratic norms in a key ally. They've issued statements urging dialogue and a swift return to constitutional order.
So the international community is watching this crisis unfold with a mixture of apprehension and condemnation. It seems like no matter how this plays out, there will be lasting consequences for South Korea's standing in the world. But what about the domestic consequences? What are the possible scenarios for how this could all unfold within South Korea?
Well, predicting the future is always a gamble. But based on the information we have, let's explore a few possible outcomes. The first scenario, and perhaps the most hopeful one, is that President Yoon backs down. The pressure from the streets, the National Assembly's defiance, and the international condemnation could force him to rescind the martial law declaration and seek a more conciliatory approach. This would likely lead to a period of intense political negotiation and compromise with potential concessions on both sides.
That sounds like the least disruptive path. But would it really resolve the underlying tensions? Wouldn't President Yoon emerge from this politically weakened?
That's a valid point. Backing down could be seen as a sign of weakness, emboldening his opponents, and potentially leading to more political instability in the long run. It would also raise questions about his judgment and ability to handle a crisis.
So a peaceful resolution might come at a high cost for President Yoon. What's another possible outcome?
Well, another scenario is that President Yoon digs in his heels. Imagine he manages to produce evidence that convinces the public, or at least a significant portion of it, that the threat he's alleging is real. This could shift public opinion in his favor, allowing him to weather the storm and emerge with his authority enhanced.
So he doubles down and essentially wins the gamble.
It's a possibility, but a risky one. Even if he convinces people of the need for martial law, it could still inflict lasting damage on South Korea's democratic institutions and its international reputation. It would also set a dangerous precedent for future leaders facing political challenges.
Sounds like a Pyrrhic victory at best. You mentioned a third scenario, the most unsettling one. What would that look like?
Well, imagine a situation where neither side backs down. The political deadlock deepens, the protests escalate, and violence spreads throughout the country. This scenario could spiral into a full-blown constitutional crisis, potentially even civil unrest.
That sounds terrifying. What would the implications of that kind of chaos be, both for South Korea and the region as a whole?
Well, the ramifications of widespread civil unrest in South Korea, would be absolutely devastating. We're talking about a country with the world's 10th largest economy, a critical player in global supply chains, and a frontline state in the standoff with North Korea.
Right.
So that kind of instability would send shockwaves through the global economy, and it could embolden the Kim regime to, make more aggressive moves.
It's a nightmare scenario, and it highlights just how high the stakes are in this crisis. But even if things don't spiral that far out of control, there's another battlefield where this conflict is already raging, the information war.
You're absolutely right. In the age of social media and instant communication, controlling the narrative is almost as important as controlling the streets.
Yeah.
And in this case, all sides are weaponizing information. They're deploying a mix of truth, half-truths, and outright lies to advance their agendas and shape public opinion.
Let's unpack that a bit.
Yeah.
Who are the key players in this information war, and what tactics are they using?
Okay, well, you have the South Korean government, of course. They're using official channels to disseminate their version of events, emphasizing the alleged threat to national security and portraying President Yoon as like a decisive leader taking necessary steps to protect the nation. They're also trying to control the flow of information, censoring certain websites and social media platforms, and cracking down on independent media outlets that challenge the official narrative.
But they're not the only ones with a megaphone, are they? Surely the opposition is pushing back with their own version of events.
Absolutely. The Democratic Party is using every means at their disposal to counter the government's narrative. They're organizing online campaigns, leaking information to journalists, and mobilizing their supporters to spread their message through social media. They're portraying President Yoon as a would-be dictator who's using trumped-up charges to silence his critics and consolidate power.
And then you have North Korea, always eager to exploit any sign of weakness or division in the South.
Oh, they're having a field day with this. They're pumping out a torrent of propaganda, portraying South Korea as a puppet state of the U.S., riddled with internal strife and on the verge of collapse. They're trying to sow discord and undermine confidence in the South Korean government, both domestically and internationally.
It sounds like a chaotic and confusing information landscape.
Yeah.
How is the average person in South Korea, or even someone observing from afar, supposed to make sense of all this competing information?
That's the challenge of the information age. It's more important than ever to be a critical consumer of information. Don't just accept everything you see or hear at face value.
Right.
Check sources, look for corroboration, and be aware of potential biases.
So a healthy dose of skepticism is in order. What else can people do to navigate this information minefield?
Well, look for patterns. If you see the same narrative being repeated across multiple sources, especially those with a history of reliability and accuracy, it's more likely to be true. Conversely, if a story only appears on obscure websites or social media accounts with a clear agenda, treat it with caution.
It's like a detective game, piecing together the truth from fragments of information.
That's a good analogy. And remember, everyone has an agenda. Governments, political parties, media outlets, they all have their own interests and perspectives.
Yeah.
Understanding those motivations is key to deciphering the information they're putting out.
This situation in South Korea is a stark reminder that in the 21st century, information is a weapon and the battlefield is everywhere. It's up to each of us to be vigilant, to be discerning, and to arm ourselves with the critical thinking skills we need to navigate this complex and ever-shifting landscape.
Well said. The future of South Korea and perhaps even the world depends on it.
That's all the time we have for today's deep dive. We hope this has given you a better understanding of the crisis in South Korea and the forces at play. Remember, the situation is still unfolding and there are many unknowns. But by staying informed, engaging in thoughtful discussion, and demanding accountability from our leaders, we can all play a part in shaping a more just and peaceful future.